After his service as an Army scout and guide during the Civil and Indian Wars, my great-grandfather migrated to what is now Red Lodge, Montana, where he was one of Montana's pioneering cattle ranchers. My father and grandfather were born and raised in Red Lodge, which sits at the foot of the Beartooth Mountain Range, where both men developed an avid love for the mountains and the wilderness. I was born in Butte, Montana, and I was raised in Missoula, where my parents passed on their love of the outdoors to my three brothers and I. Family was the most important thing to my parents, and it showed in the lifestyle that they provided us. Everyone should be so lucky as to have experienced the childhood that I enjoyed. Dad had his own business and reserved weekends for family time. My earliest memories are of the weekends spent camping at one of the many lakes within an hour or two of Missoula. When I was a teenager, Mom and Dad bought some land on a lake in the Swan Valley where we built a cabin, and from that day forward, every weekend, year-round from Friday until Sunday evening, we spent at the cabin enjoying the lake and exploring the surrounding mountains and the forest. Lily, what are you barking at? Lily. That's my little junkyard dog Pug. She'll bite your leg off. Get him, Lily. Get him. Go get that guy. Go get him. Go bite his leg off. I'm sorry. I made my first trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in the summer of my 14th year, and what an incredible adventure that was. My point is that I'm quite familiar with the flora and fauna of western Montana. My first exposure to Sasquatch was when my parents took me and my brothers to see the Patterson film as he was touring it around in the Northwest. I remember leaving there with this strange feeling of wonder. I don't remember the family ever discussing the film or Sasquatch afterward, and soon it was relegated to the deepest recesses of my mind. In 1975, I married a city girl from the suburbs of Chicago. We met while she was living with her aunt in Missoula and attending the local college. That girl took to the outdoor lifestyle like she had been doing it her whole life. And shortly after our wedding, we made a trip to the local sporting goods store and bought the camping equipment we needed to enjoy what quickly became one of our favorite pastimes. For our first outing together as newlyweds, I decided I wanted to camp somewhere new, so we headed for the Swan Valley with no particular destination in mind. Now keep in mind that the Swan Valley is the third largest intact ecosystem in the lower 48 states. 15 minutes north of Seeley Lake, I noticed a sign pointing the way to a lake I was not familiar with. I was going too fast to make the turn, so I continued on until I found a safe place to turn around, and I returned to the road, if you could call it that. It was a little more than 2 tracks wandering off through the forest in the direction the sign pointed. Although Highway 83 runs the full length of the Swan Valley, at the time north of Seeley Lake was quite sparsely populated and could be a lonely drive, particularly at night. I followed the winding tracks leading to the lake that turned out to be only about a quarter mile from the highway. Although being serviced by Highway 83, this area was and remains to this day quite remote. I approached the lake, and we were presented with the perfect campsite. Stretching out before us was a pristine mountain meadow nestled alongside a brush-lined mountain lake. It was quite obvious the area got very little use, as there weren't even the remains of a campfire anywhere. We pitched our camp, and Sasquatch was the furthest thing from our minds. We set up our tent, and we organized our gear. And then we relaxed by the lake, drinking in the clear mountain air laced with the scent of wildflowers that dotted our little slice of heaven. For me, being in the deep forest is a truly spiritual experience. It's times like that when one can feel how connected our natural world is. Dinner time came, and we prepared a meal of fresh lake trout that we had caught earlier that afternoon. And after dinner, we reclined by the fire until the sun disappeared behind the mountain, and night descended on our little meadow hideaway. After retiring to our tent for the night, we both fell fast asleep. Sometime later that night, I was awakened by the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I have to admit, I was more than a little disturbed as I lay there wondering what on earth could make such a sound. Anyone that has spent much time in the backcountry knows that a loud sound in the distance in a heavily wooded area is kind of a muffled echo. Well, this was not the case with this scream. It was the loudest, highest-pitched scream one could imagine, and there was no muffled echo. Whatever it was had to be quite close. There were a couple of more screams, and then there was silence. As I lay nervously pondering what on earth critter could make such a noise, it dawned on me just how quiet things had become. And I have to say that I'm not sure if the seeming quiet was because of the noise, whatever had made it, and it lent a new dimension to the night that made the normal night sound seem insignificant, or if it was actually as quiet as it seemed. And then the wood knocking started. And again, I found myself wondering what on earth could be making that sound. It sounded like two baseball bats being knocked together with great force. There were a couple of more knocks, and then once again silence, or at least it seemed so. I lay there trying to decipher just what woodland creature would make these incredible sounds. And through all this, my wife didn't stir in the least. I'm not sure if she heard what I had heard or not, but she gave no indication that she was awake, and I wasn't about to disturb her. I was more than a little shook up by the whole experience, but after a few minutes I concluded it was just some forest creature that I was not familiar with, and I settled myself down and was soon fast asleep. I never spoke to anyone, including my wife, about that experience until a couple of years ago, and had completely forgotten about that night altogether. About that time, I had started watching videos and researching Sasquatch. I found the topic quite interesting and the various stories fascinating. One evening, I was watching a video about Sasquatch when they played what they claimed were Sasquatch vocalizations, and the memories of that night came flooding back. What I was hearing being played sounded almost exactly like what I had heard 47 years ago. They also played wood knocking just like what I had also experienced that night all those years ago. After realizing that what I had heard was quite possibly a Sasquatch, I had the most awful, unsettling feeling in my gut, and it didn't subside for 3 days. After 2 years now of watching videos and listening to the stories and researching Sasquatch, I've come to the conclusion that Sasquatch, like all western Montana predators, can be dangerous but are rarely a threat to humans. One of the most curious conclusions I have come to is they seem to have a sense of humor and enjoy messing with humans, as demonstrated by the harmless act of throwing pine cones and small stones near campers as they gather around a campfire at night. As I recall other unusual experiences I've had in other remote locations of western Montana, I can't help but wonder if I've had more encounters than just that one night in the summer of 1975. I spent most of February 2018 in the hospital in central Louisiana. The Red River runs behind that hospital. I was on the 4th floor, and with the floor-to-ceiling windows in my room, I had the perfect view of the flooding that was occurring at that time. Every day I watched the river rise a little more. It left its bank and flooded a small part, leaving just the tops of the trees sticking out of the water. And then it flooded the parking lot and the road that went to the park. I sat there for hours watching the river traffic until it was shut down due to high water. And then I watched as all sorts of debris floated down the river. There were pieces of buildings and trees of all sizes. I even saw a car float by. Close to the bank, or what was supposed to be the bank, was a whirlpool. It must have been 8 feet across, and it spun round and around, sucking in anything that got close to it. And I often wonder where that stuff went once it got pulled under. One day my husband was there and we were watching the river as usual. Since I was bedbound, there really wasn't anything else to do. and as we watched, we saw a huge pile of debris coming down the river. It floated over toward our side, and by the time it reached us, it was hitting the tops of the trees in the park, and it started breaking up. First, I saw a big tree break off from the pile and move toward the whirlpool. And then something else broke off. As it started moving in the same direction as the tree, it turned in slow circles. I saw the end of it and then the side, and I could tell what it was, but the part that was sticking up out of the water looking like long red hair. The part in the water was moving with the flow and was darker in color, and then it turned to the other end, and this end was bobbing up and down in the water, and when the top broke the surface, it looked kind of pointed. This thing was long and big. I would say it was 9 feet long, and that's when it hit me what this thing could be. My husband thought maybe it was a cow, and then he suggested that it could be a horse, and I pointed out how it looked like it was on its belly with its arms and legs stretched out. He said he knew it was big and it had long hair, but he just wasn't sure what it was. But I was sure. As the tree was being sucked into the whirlpool, this thing stopped circling and it turned. It started down the river, and at that moment the nurse came in and drew our attention away long enough that we barely turned back in time as it floated away. My husband will only say that it was very big and hairy. He won't commit himself to say one way or another what it was. But as for me, I was in the hospital and I was on painkillers, but I know what I saw, and nothing will change my mind. In March of 2019, I left my house in suburban Philadelphia for a 5-day solo camping trip in north-central Pennsylvania. I set up camp in the most remote wilderness area of the whole state. At one point, while I was away from camp for the whole day, something with a huge four-toed human-looking bare foot came into my camp, unstaked my tent, ate some of my food, and left footprints all over the snow. I think it was 2 creatures. Some of the footprints were smaller than the others. This changed my life. I became obsessed with everything Bigfoot. I began researching Sasquatch and listening to every encounter story I could, and I still do. A few weeks ago, I had a realization. I had a close encounter in 2014, but at the time, due to my ignorance, I just told myself it was something else. Until my recent obsession, I knew very little about Bigfoot. I was under the impression they were way out in the northwest U.S. and Canada. That is, if they were even real at all. Once I dove into the topic, I realized that people had run into them in all corners of the country and indeed the world. Today, my life is just about perfect. I have a new wife, a new house, and 2 new baby girls. I retired 3 years ago at the age of 39, and I'm now a stay-at-home father who is living the dream. In November of 2014, this was not the case. Back then, everything in my life fell apart all at once. I lost my job, I lost my place to live, and my vehicle all in a matter of 1 week. The one thing I did have was a full set of camping gear. I went to the woods on the edge of a town in southern New Jersey and set up a stealth camping site to sleep in at night. In the morning, I would make the short walk into town. I'd meet my girlfriend and take her to work so I could use her car to job hunt. I would also look for a vehicle and go to the gym to shower and shave. Southern New Jersey is home to a 1 million acre wilderness known as the Pine Barrens. It's full of deer and coyotes and turkey and plant life that isn't found anywhere else. My little camp was right on the edge of it, and I was next to a brand new housing addition that was still being developed. I picked a spot off the path through the woods that the locals use to walk their dogs and in warmer months ride their off-road vehicles. I found a place that was very well hidden so anyone could easily walk in within a few yards of my tent and not see that I was there. This was aided by a huge mound between the path and my camping spot. I covered the tent with a camo tarp and surrounded the area with piles of brush. When I was inside the tent looking out, I had the path behind me, a few homes maybe a quarter of a mile straight ahead, and the new development another quarter-mile away to my left, and thousands of acres of the Pine Barrens wilderness to my right. The nights were cold, and a pack of coyotes would gather right outside the front of my tent every night about 8:30 p.m. It was like clockwork. They would fight and howl and run around doing God knows what for a few hours before finally heading into the deep woods. They didn't seem to be afraid of me being there, and they never gave me any trouble. Even so, I slept with a 26-inch full-tang short sword in my hand just to be safe. By day 5, I had set up a new job that started in a few weeks and had bought a 1996 Ford Explorer that I planned to pick up the next day when my new insurance was active. I had gotten to my tent that night just as the sun was going down around 5:30 p.m. It was going to be cold, so I put on some warm clothes. Then I ate some snacks and puffed on my vape before settling in for the night. It was about 8 p.m. and the coyotes showed up and they were raising hell. They were making so much racket that they stirred up the neighborhood dogs who were barking like crazy off in the distance. All at once they went from super noisy to running off. I could hear them whining and yelping as they ran off to my right into the deep woods. Well, I was laying on my back ready to fall asleep when an unbelievably powerful stench filled my tent. It was a really bad mixture of unpleasant aromas. It was a combination of nasty body odor, feces, skunk, and most of all, smelly feet. I sat up in my tent and I thought, what the hell? I was confused. I cannot overemphasize the absolute power of the stench. It was so overwhelming that I could barely stand it. I tried breathing through my mouth, and that was even worse. It was so strong I could taste it on the tip of my tongue. After 20 seconds or so, I decided I need to open the tent and get out of there and hopefully escape this smell. As I was unzipping the tent, I heard someone coming down the path, and then they slowly walked off into the woods to my left. It was the unmistakable sound of a person cautiously walking through the woods. I quietly zipped up the tent, and I sat there, frozen. My heart was pounding, and I thought it was the police or maybe some local homeowner coming to give me some crap. I had made the entire week unnoticed, and now someone was going to cause trouble. Life was hard enough at the time, and it was the last thing I needed. The footsteps came closer. They rounded the mound that was hiding my tent, but were still 20 feet away. Then they made their way to where the coyotes had been, just a few yards in front of my tent, and it stopped. I was as still as a statue. It was breathing deep and hoarse like a man catching his breath. Then the footsteps came right up to the very front of the tent. The tarp I had covering the tent made it impossible for me to see anything, but whoever this was, they were right there and breathing. The footsteps then continued around to the right side and then stopped again. Then it leaned its face right up to the tarp and started trying to smell what was inside. I could hear the big long sniffs, each followed by an exhale through the mouth. At this point, I wasn't so sure it was a person anymore. No man has a lung capacity that powerful, and besides, why would a person be sniffing my tent? As unlikely as it seemed, I thought it might be a bear. They're very rare in the Pine Barrens, and I was sure it had walked on 2 feet. But what else could it be, right? At this point, I decided to say something. If it was a black bear, there was a 99% chance it would run for its life as soon as it heard a human voice. "Who's there?" I said loudly, emphasizing my words with a smack on the right side of the tent with the back of my hand. It took 2 steps back and let out a long, deep, terrifying growl. My blood ran cold. I gripped my blade and poised for some sort of an attack. But to my amazement, it simply walked off in the forest. I could hear its 2-legged footsteps crunching through the leaves, getting farther and farther away until it was gone. I started to breathe again as the putrid stench began to fade, and after about a minute, I heard the loud snap of a branch breaking, followed by the sound of wood hitting wood twice. I sat there catching my breath and wondering if it was a monster or a bear. Nothing made sense. Black bears don't have a strong odor even during their mating season. I'm also certain a black bear would have run the second I opened my mouth. Sasquatch never crossed my mind. If they existed at all, I was sure it was in some far-off location, certainly not on the edge of a town in New Jersey. Once the adrenaline wore off, I was exhausted. I don't know how, but I remember sleeping well that night. The next morning, I packed everything up and got the hell out of there. A few months later, I had gotten my life squared away and had all but forgotten that night, having attributed the entire event to an encounter with a bear. Of course, now I'm pretty sure I know exactly what it was. My wife and I are originally from Cincinnati. However, for the past 30 years, we've traveled all over North America with our camper and boat and enjoyed the beauty and the bounty of this beautiful continent. We always make it back to Cincinnati for the holidays with our children and grandchildren, but the rest of the year we spend on the road. In 1999, we were in a community in Alaska where we like to salmon fish and to hunt caribou. We always gave 99% of our catch along with 2 caribou that we took there once to the locals. The meat was more than we could eat, and the indigenous people appreciated the extra food. It earned us some lifelong friendships. You couldn't imagine our joy when on this year, one of the young tribe members offered to take us to one of his spots to fish, a place where few outsiders have ever been. It demonstrated his trust in us, which was a great honor. The sight was nothing short of amazing. It was everything our young friend had promised, and the wide stream, nestled between 2 small mountains and surrounded by woods, was no deeper than our knees. The water was crystal clear with a sandy bottom, and it was teeming with salmon. 2 other members of the tribe were there when we arrived. They recognized us and offered a friendly wave. 8 large bears were also enjoying the abundant salmon, but our friend told us not to panic. "Don't bother them and they'll leave you alone," he said. He explained that they too were fishing for salmon, and chasing us off would require too much energy. And then he said, "But if they grab one of our fish, just cut the line and start over, or they will go after our catch. Just let them have it. There's plenty more fish out there." We'd been fishing for 2 hours, and everyone was catching enormous kings. The bears were having a good day as well. We were all having a great time when we heard a roar from across the creek. 2 of the other fishermen left. They didn't even gather their catch. The bears all stopped fishing and ran into the woods away from the sound. Our guide said, "We have to go now." I must have given him a defiant look because he added, "We need to leave now and leave the catch." We sensed the urgency in his voice. We knew there was danger present, so we followed him back to his truck. He didn't speak a word until we were back on the main road, and I noticed that he kept checking his rear view mirror. "What's going on?" I kept asking. "Was it a bear? What made that noise? And why did the other bears run off?" The suspense was killing me, but he would never answer. Finally, once we were on the main road, he said, "Kushtaka." "What in the world is Kushtaka?" I asked. I could see that he was clearly upset to even speak of it. He paused for a minute and gathered his words before saying, "You do not live in this land, and you should not know all of its secrets. But Kushtaka is he who rules over all the land." He paused for a minute, and then he continued. "He lays claim to all and requires tributes from us to hunt and fish his land. That is why we left our catch. If we hadn't done that, it would have brought bad luck to our people, and we would have faced his anger." He refused to speak any more about it, and when he dropped us off at the small campground outside of town where we had made camp, he told us to be ready to go by 8 a.m. tomorrow, and then he left. We spent the night trying to envision exactly what Kushtaka was. Was it a bear or some sort of monster? Years later, we learned that Kushtaka is called the Otterman. At the time, we never would have come up with that in any way, shape, or form or fashion. Over the next 4 days, our guide took us to more commonly fished and therefore more crowded areas. He refused to take us back to his honey hole. But on the 5th day, we told him we were going to go out on our own. We found our way back up to the secret spot where the bear had returned and were feasting on the fatty fish. There were no other fishermen around. Jesse and I concealed ourselves in the thick brush along the creek and waited as the bears walked within feet of us, not even giving us a second look. At 4 p.m., the roar bellowed again, sending the bears fleeing into the bush and leaving the stream for Kushtaka. Once the bears were gone and everything settled down, 3 enormous creatures, a huge male, a female with sagging breasts, and a younger male, walked into the creek and began to grab fish. They'd shove the belly of one fish into their mouths and eat the eggs with one hand while reaching down into the water to grab another fish with the other. Their mouths seemed to stretch from ear to ear. The bodies were completely covered in hair except for their faces and the palms of their hands, and their large black eyes were set further apart than a human's. Their noses gave the appearance of being smashed into their faces, and their foreheads sloped back to conical heads. We couldn't see their ears for all the hair. They stood in the middle of the creek, knees bent, and scooped up the salmon with large hands that were attached to arms that extended below their knees. Eventually, they squatted or sat down in the creek and used their arms to guide the fish into their laps. And after they took one large bite from the fish's bellies, they'd cast them aside and grab the next one. More fish bodies floated past us than we could count. The male stood 9 feet tall, and it was at least 5 feet across. His hair was black. Gray was mixed in throughout his hair, but mostly concentrated on his chin and chest. The female was more of a reddish brown. She stood 2 feet shorter than the male, and the hair on her breasts was much more sparse than on the rest of her body. She wasn't nearly as broad as the male. The juvenile was quite a bit smaller than either of the adults. He was the same size as our young Indian guide and covered in deep brown hair. They remained focused on the salmon for quite some time. They only stopped eating to defecate or urinate. Even then, they didn't get out of the water, which might be the reason their stool is never found. I brought my 35mm camera, and I managed to snap off 2 whole 36 exposure rolls of film unnoticed. The rushing water masked the clicking sound of the camera shutter. A storm was approaching, and when the wind kicked up, we retreated. We were unobserved. I couldn't wait to see how our pictures turned out. We drove straight to a little store to have them developed. And that is how it was before digital cameras, laptops, and the internet. Jesse and I had just spent 2 hours observing 3 animals that were thought to exist only in myth, or at best, rarely seen. Aside from the Patterson-Gimlin film, most evidence was footprints, but now we had solid proof that these animals exist, and we could give them the protection they need. As we watched, we'd heard them vocalizing with each other. It was a mix of clacking and popping sounds made by their lips and teeth, combined with purring and cooing. They even had a language that sounded like Chinese or Japanese. 3 days later, when we went to pick up our pictures, we were heartbroken when we were handed an empty envelope. We decided it didn't matter, though. We were already planning our next trip to the creek. We would get more pictures. 2 elders were standing by our truck when we walked outside. They asked us to join them for a ride in their beat-up Suburban, and we excitedly jumped into the back seat. When a ride was offered, it usually meant that they were going to show us something special. and in the past they'd taken us to see several secret tribal areas, including burial grounds, totem poles, and some drawings on cliffs and rocks. That day there wasn't much conversation on the trip other than a little small talk. We drove for half an hour along dirt trails and creek crossings until we arrived at an old log cabin that looked like it had been abandoned. The roof was peeled back, the windows were knocked out, the door was missing. A few outbuildings looked like they had been bulldozed over. It had been left to nature, and nature was greedily taking it back. We pulled up to the cabin, and the two elders got out and went to sit on a couple of big rocks, and they waited for us to approach them before the chief began to speak. We know of your curiosity, and we worry about your lives as well as the lives of our people when you leave. Your photos were destroyed, but we cannot stop you from going back to take more. I want you to know everything that will occur if you do. This cabin belonged to a family from the lower states, he said, gesturing with his hand. They wanted to live off the grid, as they put it, to teach their children how to live off the land. They lived here for a couple of years, and they were well liked by our people. We shared many of our traditions with them to help make their lives easier. To continue the story was becoming difficult for the chief, and the other elder took over. The father had constructed a smokehouse for the salmon he had taken that year, and the bears tore it apart, stealing most of their catch. This led to concerns that there would not be enough food to get through the winter. They drove to town and bought several boxes of ammo for the father's hunting rifle. The next week he returned to town to buy more salt to cure the meat from a huge moose he had harvested. He told us then that he was afraid the bear would return. The old man lowered his head and thought for a moment before he continued. We listened to his story about his moose hunt and about all of his concerns, and we realized that this might be Kushtaka. We advised him to leave a quarter of the meat out further away from the house, but he said they had taken enough and he wasn't giving up any more. That night, he had strung cans with rocks in them to alert him of the meat thieves, and sure enough, that night he heard something and ran out to chase it off or to shoot it. We know he hit something from the blood that trailed into the bush and the large footprints we found along the trail. By this time, the chief regained his composure and continued the story. We grew concerned a couple of days later when we did not see him or his family back in town. They never came back. Several of our tribe drove up there to find his cabin torn open like you see it now. All the other buildings had been beat down to the ground, and there were Kushtaka footprints all over their home site. We found the father curled up right over there. He pointed to an old mountain hemlock tree. He was clinging to life, but twisted and beaten. His body was covered in blood and his legs were broken, and we later learned that he'd suffered internal damage. We rushed him to town, where he was taken by helicopter to Anchorage for treatment. He kept muttering, they came, and they took my wife and daughter." He never said anything else, just those same words over and over. State troopers came to investigate, and they questioned us. They asked us if he could have killed his family, and we didn't believe that he could have. The troopers concluded that it must have been a bear that did all that damage. And again, the chief stopped and shook his head. But we knew better. We are of the land and of the water, and we could see the tracks and the claw marks on the building. We followed the blood trail before the troopers destroyed the evidence. We saw where the injured Kushtaka ran toward the river. We saw where it had fallen several times before it was picked up and carried by other Kushtaka. We did not venture further. We did not want to risk the consequences of trespassing on Kushtaka land. The chief's eyes filled with tears as he said, "The wife was nowhere to be found, nor was the daughter. Our stories tell of many times when Kushtaka would come to our villages and take women and children. The chief told us that he had driven to the hospital to visit the man, and he found him curled up in his bed repeating, "They came." Over the next 5 years, the chief made that same trip every year. And then some of his family from the lower 48 came and took the father home. The chief told us that he felt responsible for what happened because he knew that it was Kushtaka when the father first came to town for the ammo, but he didn't tell him about the beast, and he said he should have. Several hunters from our village came up missing that year, and half of our dogs disappeared, he said. They were dragged away in the middle of the night. Kushtaka came to take his revenge. And just like he took his revenge on the father for shooting one of his own, he let him live, but he broke his leg so he couldn't walk. He could only lie there and watch. After hearing this story, Jesse and I began to think about what would happen if we had taken those photos and then showed them to the wrong people. This peaceful slice of heaven would be overrun with people trying to kill or capture one, and the people who would pay dearly for it would be the local tribe. We decided to leave the Kushtaka be. We made a few more trips up there and tried to earn the tribe's trust again, but it was never the same. The community never showed the trust that they once had. They were always nice to us and respectful. They just didn't share stories or traditions with us ever again. We never returned to the guide's honey hole after that. We saw the guide a few times, but he always turned and walked the other way. He never spoke to us again. Jesse and I eventually decided never to return to the village. We'd lost the joy we once felt by being there, and it was a costly lesson in trust.